have to check about every 16 minutes or so for that thing. So right now it's...
Did you figure out if it was cut off because we were just running out of memory, or did it just cut off?
No, it just does that because of the camera. It's frustrating. Okay. 3, 2, 1. All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Igor podcast. I'm hopefully not in the way of everybody. I'm joined here today with, once again, Dr. Mitch McGee, microbiology professor here at Arizona State University. Very excited to have him on here. We wanted to have him come on to talk more so about some of the specific things that people are, I guess, concerned about. More so like genetic modification of foods and of plants, and if that's really causing us health issues, and if that's something we should actually be concerned about. So we're here. Dr. Mitch McGee, would you mind giving yourself a quick introduction?
Hi, I'm Mitch. I'm a microbiologist whose my research area has been focusing on what we call immune responses to infectious diseases. I study several important pathogens. One of these is tuberculosis. It causes a disease in about a third of the world's population. It's a major pathogen. And in Arizona, we have a disease called valley fever. And so I've spent a lot of time studying the basic mechanisms of how the body responds to valley fever and if we could create a vaccine. So I'm interested in infectious disease and how the body responds.
Good, because we're not going to talk about that today.
That'd be a great topic for another podcast, though.
Yeah, we'll love to have you come back on to actually talk about what you research.
But I teach microbiology, which you were in the class, and we went over a wide range of topics.
Yes. So, and that's what gave me the inspiration to talk about this. So let's just dive right into it. Can you give us a brief overview of what GMO, genetically modified organism is, and whether it's safe or not to eat in our food?
Okay, there's the basic definition is that what we know is that the genes of a plant or of a human are encoded in his genome, right? And so each gene basically encodes for one protein. And what we try to do with genetic modification is take enhanced characteristics from one organism and put it into another. Now let's talk about kind of the worst case scinario I think of is Monsanto's use of...
that's a famous name. I've heard that. Cited in literature for quite a lot.
And so they have a gene, they have a protein that will degrade the molecule Roundup, which is a herbicide to keep weeds down. So if you put this gene inside of corn, you can spray Roundup on the corn and it won't hurt it because that protein that degrades the Roundup degrades it so it can't hurt the plant, but it kills all the weeds. So the idea is it's better for the farmer to be able to grow and not have to worry about weeding and doing all the other stuff he has to do, and yet he can spray Roundup and it won't hurt his crop. Now there's a bunch of problems with that. Roundup is a weed killer, an herbicide, and it may have effect on human people. It's my understanding, I haven't seen the data, but if they stop spraying for a certain period of time, by the time that product gets to the table, there's no detectable Roundup on that food. That's my understanding of the way it goes. Now, that's kind of the worst case scenarios, and you can see now there's commercials now, lawyers asking, have you ever been exposed to Roundup? If you have, you may be at increased risk of getting lymphoma or other cancers. So the people who have to deal with Roundup probably have a higher level of exposure to Roundup than people who get the food. The other major problem I have with Monsanto is their business practices. The scary thing is right now there are like 4 major companies that do genetic modification. 2 of them are talking about merging so that now instead of having 4, we're only going to have 2. So 2 major companies, one in the US, one in Germany, are going to contain almost all of the intellectual property of being able to create genetically modified organisms. And most people are worried about this, being able to get what's going to be the next herbicide after Roundup, because Roundup, the patent on Roundup, is my understanding, is getting ready to quit soon. So they need the next generation of herbicide so that they can put their gene into that and keep their product going. So what they've done though is farmers used to be able to save a certain portion of their crop for next year's seed. Now Monsanto won't let farmers maintain a seed stock. They have to buy seed every year. And these genetically modified seeds are very expensive. Now the initial concept of genetic modification has been around, in my view, for tens of thousands of years. And if you look at it, we have been doing what's called selective breeding. We take the characteristics of two what we think enhanced plants would be, we cross them, and we hope those enriched characteristics make more yield, better product. And so we've been doing selective breeding for tens of thousands of years in animals, in plants, and that has led to some problems here, basically a lot of monoculture, meaning that these big fields only contain one genetically strain of wheat or rice or whatever it is. And if you get a disease that can wipe that one out, you can lose your whole crop very quickly. So we're losing genetic diversity while we're gaining enhanced characteristics for an individual crop. We're losing some genetic diversity, and so you've heard about some of these seed. There's seed banks now that are going out and collecting the wild varieties of all these and banking them, so we'll have that genetic information later, which I think is a great thing that we're doing. So you never know when we're going to need a new characteristic. So genetic modification in its strictest definition is taking a gene from one organism, putting it into another. In this case, like this Roundup resistant gene, and put it into the plant, and so the plant is Roundup resistant. But one of the better definition, a good aspect of it, is you may have heard of golden rice. Around the world, rice is a major food crop, and the normal white level rice does not have a high level of nutrition. One group has created what they call golden rice. So they've inserted the gene to produce beta-carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A, and it is a more nutritious rice. And so in areas where they have resource poor conditions, they can't take vitamins on a daily basis, or they can't get enough adequate food. This is a supplement to a normal staple that is more nutritious. I have no problems with that. But it's still inserting a foreign gene from outside. I'm not sure where they got the beta-carotene gene, carrots, put it into rice.
And so that's still classified as a GMO. So
that's a GMO.
So would you say that there are more instances and cases where genetic modification poses a positive benefit over a negative, or is that kind of difficult to say?
I think most people would say that it's the opposite. Most of the business practices are aimed at putting these antibiotic or herbicide-resistant genes into crops so that they can overcome spraying, which most people would say is a negative.
Gotcha, interesting. Jay, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering. So you say that they spray these herbicides on the plants, right? Has there ever been any cases where, the herbicides are used to protect against the insects?
Well, or weeds, or they could protect against insects. Yes.
Has there ever been a case where the insects that are meant to protect, use the herbicides to protect against, develop a resistance to the herbicide?
Absolutely, and it's very difficult. There have actually been an instance of transference of resistance gene into some plants outside the field. So the people are worried about these genes becoming uncontrolled. And if we take a step back and think about herbicide resistance or boll weevil resistance, like antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance in microbes is a major problem in the world. We're running out of adequate antibiotics to treat some diseases, tuberculosis, some of those. You may have heard of multi-drug resistant TB.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the high form of that, the extremely drug-resistant TB, there's not a good treatment system. And so, same thing can happen. Those resistance genes can get into the wild, this is the thought, and could then become part of nature and get into places where we don't want them. So that was a really good question.
So I'm assuming, is this one of the bigger concerns that people have? Because I know the possible health concerns, like you said, usually this doesn't make it to the consumer, the herbicide, right? It's not there anymore once it hits a person's dinner table. But that's a health concern, but now there's this the ethical concerns that come along with it.
I think the ethical concerns are underneath the health concerns, but they're becoming more important. So it's something that, being able to control what you put out into the wild is very difficult, and this kind of leads to so we use traditional molecular biology tools to put genes into plants or take genes out of plants. And that's been around since basically the 1970s. We're now coming up, and hopefully we spend a little bit of time on this new gene editing system called CRISPR. Technically it's CRISPR-Cas9. This has become so easy for doing genetic editing in plants, deleting a gene or adding a gene, that it's a phenomenal wave that's hitting science. In fact, there was a story, and it's so easy to do, that a guy in California took some of his own white cells, did a CRISPR editing in his garage, and injected them back into himself.
I remember you talking about that in class.
So it doesn't take super high level facilities to do some of this CRISPR editing. You have to get some tools to be able to do this.
And know a thing or two.
And you have to know a thing or two. But
so is this one thing that you think that we can control? Let's say a gene that you don't want out in the wild. You can just take it out just like that.
Well, in theory, so what this is kind of getting targeted for is what they call, basically editing out species. You can delete species. So in Africa, there's groups of mosquitoes that specifically carry malaria. So the question is, if you killed off all of those malaria-carrying mosquitoes, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I would argue to say that it's a good thing.
Initially, that's the thought.
Yeah, but then there's this issue where, okay, you're eliminating a whole species that's part of a food chain. How does that affect the rest of the?
Exactly.
How does that affect the rest of the bottom line and the top of it?
What eats most of the larvae that are swimming around in the river, all the little fishies that eat the larvae that then get eaten by bigger fishies. You don't know what's going to happen. Will another species just kind of take over that realm? But this is called gene drives. And this is as a result of CRISPR editing of DNA. We could create gene drives to kill off whole species. Now,
that's just your scary thought.
Well, I mean, we've killed off one species that we know of. Intentionally, smallpox. It's still alive in some labs. Smallpox is actually a fairly small virus. Well, actually, it's a large virus of all the viruses, but it only has about 228 genes. That doesn't sound like much. People have about 20,000 genes, 25,000 genes. But what we know now, all the advances in molecular biology have gotten so great that we can now do what we call gene synthesis to build a genome. One of a famous scientist, Craig Venter, who was part of the Human Genome Sequencing Project, has been recently working on creating what's been the smallest replicating genome. He got it down to about 700 54 genes from an organism called Mycoplasma. And so it's one of the smallest living bacteria. So only 700 genes are required for replicating life. But what he did that was so interesting is that he created that genome through chemistry. He synthesized the DNA and put it together and assembled it with molecular biology tools. So he created a synthetic genome. Then he took that genome and put it into a bacteria that had all of its nucleic acids removed, and that started replicating. That is the first case of man replicating life.
Let's hold that out for a second. I just want to double check the camera. Okay, cool.
The power to eliminate a complete species from the food chain. You also have the power to create and selectively create a new species exactly the way that you want it.
Exactly.
So
That is genome by design. Now, if you think so, we're thinking about that. Smallpox only has 228 genes. One of the things that's even scarier is influenza. Influenza has been in the news recently. We've had a very bad influenza year. Over 80 children have died from influenza in the U.S. That's a very high number compared to what normally happens. Influenza only has 8 to 9 genes. Now, one of the big worries is back in 1918, a strain of influenza came around that wiped out hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people worldwide. And what was strange is it didn't really kill the very young. It didn't kill the very old. It killed the 15 to 35-year-olds. It killed you guys.
It was a range that it was selectively.
It was really strange. But so here it is. This small genome, 9 genes. People are worried about the ability to rebuild that influenza genome and turn it loose.
So to weaponize it, basically.
Well, all they have to do is get it back out there, right? It's possible to do that with the gene synthesis tools.
So if something like that happened, and we'll turn it back to GMOs in a second.
Oh, sorry.
But I want to ask.
It's a genetic.
Yeah.
It's basically creating a genome by design, which is genetically modifying things.
So if something like that were to happen, like a bioterrorist releases something like this out into the world, would we have something to combat it, counteract it, or?
It all depends on the disease. So with influenza, right now, the way we like to vaccinate people with influenza, a lot of people are afraid of vaccines.
We'll talk about that in a bit.
A lot of people are afraid of vaccines, but vaccines are one of the single most effective mechanisms of reducing mortality since they started in maybe the 14 or 1500s with smallpox vaccinations that they tried. But one of the things that I think is telling is that you can design. I lost my train of thought here. Sorry, I'm gonna have to edit.
You can design something.
What I'm saying, so if you,
Vaccines.
so you could design a vaccine.
Yeah.
So the idea is, if you knew what was out there, you could design a vaccine fairly quickly and get it up and going. But a normal route, it takes about 9 months to predict what the strains of vaccines are going to be, or the strains of influenza that are going to be coming around. And so they have to predict that 6 to 9 months in advance to be able to make the stocks.
And you said that we could develop a vaccine fairly quickly. Is this assuming that the whatever we're fighting against has like you said, like 9 genes in its
Well,
genome?
the genome size is not that critical. We think of it, we have very great vaccines for Bordetella pertussis. You've heard of that, whooping cough. They make commercials about that now, and I'm kind of sensitive as my daughter just had a baby, and my granddaughter is only 2 months old. And so one of the things that I did is that she doesn't have any immunity right now. So I went and got a booster shot for pertussis.
Yeah.
It's a combination. It's diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus. Because I don't want to be carrying pertussis and expose her. That's called cocoon immunization.
Yeah.
You immunize all the people around the susceptible groups. With that, this organism, pertussis, has thousands and thousands of genes, but we know what the protective antigens are. And so we could probably make that fairly quickly. But there's a lot of diseases we've not been able to create vaccines for. HIV. HIV has been one of the most actively studied viral diseases, and we can't make a good vaccine for it yet.
So let's
get back to GMO.
we'll round that up real quick because there's some other topics I want to talk about. So just to summarize, GMOs, are they in our food? Are they generally overall safe for us to consume, or is it still kind of fuzzy?
I'm not
What's your
concerned.
take?
I'm not concerned on GMO corn, GMO wheat, in terms of herbicide containment.
Mhm.
I'm concerned about the ethics, some of the ethical things
Yeah.
of big companies dealing with farmers, and I could understand people wanting to know if their food has GMOs in it. I am not one of these people that say don't label it. So I think that if it was properly labeled and people had a choice, the marketplace will decide.
Yeah.
But there are places where we need food. We need rice that can grow in salty water, because our oceans are the ability to grow rice is getting in brackish water is a major problem. We need higher production. We need corn that can produce more corn kernels. We
Mhm.
need rice that can produce more kernels, wheat that can produce more kernels.
Mhm.
And so, because we're not going to have enough food in 100 years to feed everybody that's going to be here.
And we can.
And we can do some of that through genetic modification.
Gotcha. All right. There's mic drop number 1. Cool. So now I wanted to get into vaccines. This is the exciting stuff too. Also, I know we talked a little bit about this in class and last time. So, can you give us the background story about how the whole vaccine controversy started? So, for real quick, for those who don't know, there's this whole controversy going around that vaccines lead to or cause autism, and that's not necessarily grounded in truth, and we'll hear why.
Yeah, which is why I'm assuming why parents are a lot more hesitant to vaccinate their children now, even with
Right.
something like with the flu.
With the flu, with pertussis, we had, I want to be careful how I say this. Last year, it doesn't sound like much, but over 50 children died of pertussis.
Which is a lot considering we had the technology to prevent it.
Well, that's
Right.
a lot considered. Well, as 15, 20 years ago, that was near zero.
Yeah. It should be zero
Yeah.
forever since we have
Yeah,
the
exactly.
vaccinations and
So from 0 to
the same
50, that's
thing.
a-
There's a lot of children's diseases, measles, mumps, rubella,
Yeah.
and it was the MMR that started off the controversy with this English physician. His name was Andrew Wakefield. He was actually studying a small set of children, I believe it was 8 or 9 children, that had an intestinal disease. And he noted that some of them had autism-like symptoms, and he attributed the development of the autism with the deposition of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Now, that was a study with 8 children back in the early 1990s.
Mhm.
Since then, which is a reasonable, I have no problem with him publishing a paper like that, if that was the real result.
Mhm.
It turns out that he was trying to promote a different therapy for measles, mumps, rubella associated with a company. And he wanted not people to be vaccinated with measles, mumps, and rubella. And he ended up manipulating this paper to make the MMR vaccine look bad.
So people could go to the RMM vaccine or something.
And so over a course of time, science, the way science is done, is that a person will typically do a series of studies. They actually have to write a grant first and get somebody to fund it, because many scientific studies cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And so you have to write a grant to tell the funding agency, this is what I want to do. You do that study and then you write it up and it undergoes peer review. Peer review means that other scientists get a chance to say, well, you didn't do this control, or I want to see this experiment. So you get a chance to revise and edit it. Well, a lot of studies were started evaluating MMR efficacy and the association with autism. And the Center for Disease Control ended up releasing in, I believe, 2007, what they call a meta-study of over 400,000 children that showed no association of autism with the
Wow.
MMR vaccine.
So you got 400,000
Versus the 8.
versus the 8,
Right.
and we still have this hysteria. around
Well, what
vaccines.
happens is a few prominent people take this up.
Yes, true.
And if somebody has a voice and they want to use it, some people will be afraid.
Why do you think it is though that those figures take that stance?
Well, it's
And it's more so just an opinion question that I want.
well, you know. So Andrew Wakefield and I haven't seen this yet. I should have seen this.
Yeah.
He created basically a documentary called Vaxxed, where he's kind of chronicled his side of everything.
Right.
And this was submitted to the Tribeca Film Festival.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm blanking out on his name.
Was it a celebrity?
Yeah, it's
Did you say, was it George Clooney?
no. It's
A celebrity.
a celebrity.
And I was like, what movie is he in?
He was on The Godfather, and he was the Godfather in Godfather 2.
Oh, there you go.
The young guy.
So there you go. We
Keep
got some
talking, I'll
context.
find him.
Anyway, his son had autism, and he ended up denying this film then a spot in his Tribeca Film Festival after he studied it. And although he still thinks there may be an association,
Robert De Niro?
Robert De
This
Niro.
is De Niro. Oh my god.
There we go.
I mean, as famous of a man as Robert De Niro is, I feel like if he takes a stance on something, people will pick it up real quick.
Well, but there's other people that I'm not going to mention that who think they're doing people a favor by saying there's this causation out there.
Yeah.
And people have to believe in the science, but as we know, people are fearful of science these days.
Unfortunately, it's a lot easier to listen to somebody famous than to listen to the actual science.
Yeah.
Exactly, and so I mean, there's people that still deny climate change. There's people that still like what I was mentioning in HIV in
I'm
class.
pretty sure there's still people that deny that the world is round.
There are flat.
That is a movement. That is now a movement.
There's the flat earthers, yes.
You go far enough, you fall off the edge.
And so it's if a difficult situation because sometimes people let fear override their ability to think.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's one of the easiest weapon to use, right?
It is an easy weapon.
So what do you think people in your position, in our position, can do to perpetuate the actual science? And
We'll
the
talk
right
about the
things?
science. Exactly, is that I was in a hospital waiting room waiting for an appointment, and there was a young pregnant mother, and a lady was sitting next to her, and this lady started talking to her about don't get your baby vaccines, and I had to.
Oh my God!
And she goes, "I'm a nurse. I know this stuff."
And she's a nurse.
Wow.
And I had to say something, and I said, "Ma'am, you talk to your own physician. You need to get the facts. The association of
Wow.
MMR and autism has been debunked. The paper has been retracted. The science is not valid."
Yeah.
Which happens. Sometimes papers get
Yeah.
retracted. And I said, look, I've studied infectious disease and vaccines for 30 years. This stuff works.
Yeah. Hey, if I can ask, what was her response?
She said, she said, "Thank you for talking to me. I'll talk to my doctor." That's all. That's the only thing I could
Yeah.
say. But there are people who don't want to talk to their doctors. There's people that
Yeah.
fear that there's some conspiracy out there.
Unfortunately, there are people who believe that their doctors have agendas, which is why they're resistant to talk to their physicians.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, well, you also have to be careful that your physician may not always know.
Yeah.
Do not hesitate to challenge your physician. And if he can't respond to a challenging question, get another physician.
I'm gonna hold that thought real quick. So we can go to the next.
Well, I mean, there was, and during the HIV, I was in graduate school as the HIV epidemic hit in the early 1980s, and people were paralyzed. They didn't know what it was. They did not know how to fight it. They thought it was a chemical interaction of a certain set of homosexual men who took drugs and these kinds of things, and they thought it
I
was.
remember that.
And it took a number of years for people to propose, say, look, this is a virus, here is this virus. And there was a very prominent retrovirologist who said HIV does not cause AIDS. And he still, to this day, still states that. I don't understand his rationale. I haven't investigated it in a while, but all of our studies know that it's that if you get exposed to the HIV virus and it starts replicating inside of you, if you don't get treatment, you will likely develop what's called acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and you will succumb, typically within 5 to 15 years. Now, the treatment for HIV has gotten so good now that they're able to extend that period of no severe symptoms for many, many, many years. And they're starting to find several groups of people out there, what they call long-term non-progressors, who basically have HIV in their blood, but they cannot detect the development of the acquired immune deficiency symptoms.
Has there been any attempt to study those people and why?
Though it's working like crazy. It's unclear. They're looking at the genetics. There may be a certain genetic component to these people that they're able to respond differently than other people. But possibly with CRISPR-Cas9, we could change that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is I think one of the really great positives too, is that now you have these group of people who seem to not manifest any of these the symptoms, right? You find the gene that's maybe making them immune to it, you take it out, you put it in a vaccine, and now suddenly you have something against this disease who not too long ago was crippling the nation.
It's crippling many countries. South Africa is ravaged by HIV and tuberculosis. So there's a huge problem. So that's another possibility to kind of flip back into genetic modification, which I don't know if you really want me to.
No, you're fine.
So there are certain genetic diseases that are a result of a single nucleotide chain or one amino acid chain change in a big protein. Cystic fibrosis is one of these. We know that we delete one amino acid, 3 nucleotides that code for that amino acid gets deleted in a gene that is almost 1,500 amino acids long. It's a very big gene. And that causes the disease cystic fibrosis. And people with the severe forms of the disease are lucky if they live to 30. And they have big problems with clearing mucus out of their lungs. If you could correct with CRISPR editing, make him a GMO, that is gene therapy. Gene therapy has been tried and failed a number of times to correct small gene problems in people. But I think with CRISPR-Cas9, that's going to bring it back up again and allow for some new mechanisms for treating patients with genetic diseases.
Interesting. So I want to take this into another route.
Okay.
We talked about this a little bit, but I want to dive into it more to help the audience understand what it is. There's a concept in science that we all know is correlation is not equal causation. And we talked about that a little bit when we were talking about vaccines, because like with that study, we just saw one study with the 8 people, with the 8 children that didn't even establish causation, just established
Just a
a
correlation.
potential link or correlation between vaccines and autism. So could you explain exactly what correlation does not equal causation means, and why that's important for people to understand? The difference between a correlation and actual establishing causation.
Okay, so what again? So this when people start studying a disease, they try to start measuring all the parameters that they can, and it's coming now to where we're getting tools that allow to give us a lot of information, like genome sequencing. Say that somebody was developing a tumor. So they take some of their normal cells, they take some of the tumor cells and do a full genome sequencing on there. And they want to find the mutation that's in the tumor cells, but not in the host cells. They try to find what is the mutation. And it turns out that with a lot of cancers, there's probably anywhere from 4 to 6 key mutations that make it become a metastatic disease. So they can look at these, but when you start looking at genome sequences and you're looking at thousands and thousands of genes, there's genes that change but have no relationship with the disease. There's a correlation that when a person has the disease or the tumor is there, this gene is changed. That's called a passenger mutation. Now there's certain genes that are what they call driver mutations. These are the ones that cause some kind of physiological change. And so to be able to identify that takes dissecting that gene out and studying it in a very controlled situation, so you can see if you change this gene in a certain cell, it starts making its way towards tumor progression. And so that's how you determine causation. You have to isolate and narrow things down, but there's often a correlation of certain changes with the disease that may have nothing to do with the causation. So it takes a lot longer to establish causation. And this is, to bring it back to microbiology, this goes back to what we call Koch's postulates, if you remember that or not. But it's how did you establish that a disease is caused by a certain bacterium? You have to find that bacterium in all cases of the disease. You have to be able to isolate that bacterium. You culture it, pure culture, and study it. Then you introduce that organism into a healthy host, and most often this is done in animal studies. And that animal has to develop the disease again, and you have to re-isolate the disease organism. So there's 4 steps to Koch's postulates. Now, there's times we can do that, and there's times we can't do that. There are certain diseases, like HIV.
It mutates so fast that it's hard
Well, that's why we can't get a vaccine, because it mutates really fast. But to be able to establish that you can't ethically take HIV and put it into somebody to say, and there's no good animal models that shows human HIV it only deals in humans, so you can't ethically do the Koch's postulates to prove that. And there are certain diseases that are not culturable. One of which we talk about is, you may have heard, prions. These are the infectious proteins.
Yeah.
That it's not an agent. It's no nucleic acid. It's actual protein. It's the chronic wasting syndrome or Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. That if you eat this, you get plaques.
Mad cow disease.
Mad cow disease. If you eat a cow with the mad cow protein, and you eat that protein, it starts making your normal proteins in your brain misfold, and it creates plaques. And over a long period of time, you get severe deficiencies. And it kills you.
They can also come from eating a just human brain, right? Like
there was Kuru, exactly.
Yeah. Lesson learned: don't be a cannibal.
And if you do, don't eat brains. or
Yeah,
spinal cord.
at least don't eat the brain part. I know it's the most appetizing looking piece, but stay away from the brain. So just to summarize real quick, correlation does not equal causation. Basically, just because there's a high incidence of something that occurs from, say, like a gene or having some kind of habit or behavior, does not mean that it necessarily causes it. So not 100% of the people that perform this behavior or have this gene, if it's just a correlation, 100% of those people aren't going to develop the condition.
Right.
Whereas if it causes it, then if you do this behavior, or if you have this gene, or if you possess this thing, then you're going to develop this thing. Right.
Correct.
Okay. And so the reason why I wanted to talk about that is because we always hear in media sources and on the news and everything that so-and-so thing doing such thing or eating such thing has a correlation with another thing. And the news will take that and say, this causes this. So I just want everyone to realize that it's not typically a causation. It's typically a correlation, and even then, it's most likely that thing or that food that you're eating isn't going to cause what the issue is.
Yeah.
So
And take us to something that a lot of our audience is familiar with, right? Obesity. There's a very big correlation that obesity increases the incidence of heart disease. But then you also have a lot of obese people out there who are perfectly healthy. Right?
relatively, yes.
Yeah, relatively healthy.
Yeah.
More so than their healthy weight or healthy BMI counterparts.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing. Speaking on that, I don't know if you know anything about this. This is kind of out of your scope. But people do say, at least I've heard, that obesity is a genetic thing. Is there any truth to that?
Oh man, I'm not gonna name any names, but I know one professor at ASU who was harping on this hardcore. He's all about this. Like,
we'll have to
obesity is caused by your genes.
We'll have
No
to-
matter what you do, you are gonna become obese if you have the genetic predisposition to become obese.
I think
You might know who we're talking about.
calories and nutrition control is a very complex issue.
Yes. 100%.
So one of the things that has been, and again, one of these correlation studies is that you may have heard that people are now studying what they call microbiomes of various areas. The gut microbiome is one of those, and that's one of the easiest to study. And as an example, there's one disease called Clostridium difficile that people get. If you have to take antibiotics a lot, it kills off most of the normal, healthy, great bacteria in your gut. And when that happens, this other organism called Clostridium difficile starts to overgrow. And it can cause major diarrhea symptoms. And it sounds not so appetizing, but the best therapy that has come out is what they call fecal microbiota transplants.
Yes, I've heard of that.
So they transplant stool from a healthy person into someone with Clostridium difficile.
So what I always wanted to know, sorry to interrupt, how do they actually perform the transplant? Like, what, I guess, orifice
There's a couple of different ways
does it go into?
There's a
I
couple
hope
of
not orally.
Yeah.
they actually, well, they do it through gavage. They insert a tube that goes all the way down into your duodenum.
Oh.
And so
okay.
you don't have to eat.
Yeah.
There's no pills.
I was always
There's no
so
soup.
curious about
Well, there's
how
also
it actually happens.
it's just an enema. They
Okay.
basically
Okay, that's a lot easier.
and so there's a couple of different ways
Yes,
they can get
yes,
it there.
yes.
Because you actually don't want it to go through your stomach where it's highly acidic. You want to get it straight into your
Gotcha, okay.
duodenum so
Makes
that it can
sense.
get into the small
Makes
intestine.
sense.
So again, there's there's some correlations with obesity and certain gut flora.
Mhm.
Or that people who have obesity, their gut flora has changed. We don't know what comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll be
Oh,
interesting.
so does the change in your gut microbiome happen first?
We don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's
So
that's the question.
That's one of the big questions.
Gotcha.
So that's fighting weight can be a very difficult thing for people.
Yes, that's the big challenge that we're taking on right now. Since we're on the topic of the microbiome, I wanted to talk about that a little bit. And once again, this is a little bit out of your scope, but I guess this whole podcast is. How much does our nutrition have of an influence on the microbiome?
This is something that I was trying to read the original scientific literature. There is some studies out there now that one of the big hot things is to take probiotics. Right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's where they actually culture a range of bacteria, and you take it in a pill. Well, there's some scientists out there that are saying, no. You need prebiotics. You need to eat what promotes a healthy set of bacteria. And he has I've heard of magical diets that are out there, and I don't know what to think of those yet. But what you eat will dramatically influence your gut microbiome. I do believe that.
Yeah.
And so if you change your eating habits, you will change your microbiome.
And so I know for one example, like yogurt, like dairy yogurt from cows, that's kind of the staple food that is touted to be full of live active cultures and everything like that. What other foods, is it like every food has some kind of
contribution towards a healthy microbiome?
Yeah, or is it specific categories?
Assuming, of course, these are natural foods, not like very minimally processed foods.
Right. So if you look at most things, like I think most vegetables are not going to have a ton of bacteria that unless they're soil contaminated, but you typically wash most of that off.
Yeah.
But most anything that's from dairy, milk, cheeses, they all have their own microbiota that's in there. So, but if you take, and if you think of a steak, it's basically taken from a sterile site.
Yeah,
it has no microbiota, and you have to cook it,
kills
more
bacteria.
Yeah.
But there are certain people that take, if you eat sushi, that's raw fish. It's still almost all protein, but it should be basically fairly aseptic, unless it's been mishandled.
Yeah.
So
you don't want to eat that kind of sushi.
And today, speaking of that, I just watched a BBC video about all the different types of parasites and worms and everything that can get in you, and they're talking about
sushi.
Yeah.
About sushi and the beef tapeworm, pork tapeworm, and all that stuff. And I don't know if I can.
You don't remember? We went over the fish.
No, we did. And there was that one that swims up your urethra, the fish.
Oh,
that was in the video too.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, Jay, do you have any other questions? Because I'm gonna wrap it up with one quick portion.
So Michael asked what kind of foods contribute to the healthy microbiome. What do you think is doing the opposite? What do you think that's part of the American diet in general?
I don't think we know.
I
don't think we know enough yet.
Okay.
Because if you think about it, bacteria are typically great. Well, actually, I just read an article.
Because you know how there's this whole big debate about a lot of the things that Americans eat are highly acidic. So that's usually what's contributing to our health problems. That's my train of thought. But you said we don't really know.
I don't think. Well, one of the things, my daughter, who's breastfeeding right now, gave me a really interesting article from the Proceedings of the National Academy, a very prestigious journal. And what they found is they were analyzing human milk compared to cow milk, some of the other things. There's apparently a very complex polysaccharide that humans make that no other mammals make. And it turns out that this complex polysaccharide specifically enriches for a certain bacteria in your gut. And they were talking about how this led to breastfed babies have less problems with certain diseases, but they get the immunoglobulins from the mother because the mother passes that through the breast milk. So they're getting passively immunized with antibodies. But,
including that polysaccharide.
But the polysaccharide helps enrich for a certain set of bacteria in the gut.
Okay.
And this bacteria was just really, it helped the kids. They gained weight faster. They thrived a little bit better. So that's one. So there's so many things that we don't know about what we eat and how it affects the microbiome. I don't know if there's certain bad things that you want to take. Well, clearly if you take antibiotics, that's one of the things that will wipe out your gut bacteria.
Which is why they always kind of suggest, hey, if you're taking antibiotics for such a long time, you want to restore that. Which is why I'm guessing it's always recommended to take some kind of a pre or probiotic.
Probiotic or yogurt. I mean, that's my son had ear infections almost every 3 weeks for 2 years. And he'd take antibiotics and he would get yeast infections because it would just overgrow until we started feeding him yogurt, and it stopped the yeast infections.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So you have to think about nutrition, about what you eat. We don't know enough yet, but that would be a really good area of study. Is what is going to manipulate to a more healthy microbiome? How do you get it that way?
Yeah, I know. I attended a conference 2 years ago, and there was a speaker who touched on the gut microbiome and its interaction with the whole system. And so I thought that was really neat. I didn't really understand it at the time because I was still fairly new to nutrition and everything. But yeah, I think in maybe like 5 years we'll have a very rich understanding of it, because there is a lot of research coming out about
There's a lot of research going on being able to analyze the microbiome. It's not an easy thing to study, because you're dealing with thousands of different species of organisms usually. And to be able to analyze that data and do the correlation and causation studies are difficult.
So to bring it back to breastfeeding, because it sounds like obviously breastfeeding has a lot of advantages and everything to it. So would our children that are not breastfed, are they do they have a greater likeliness to developing like issues, like disease and things like that?
I think they have more problems with infectious disease early on. I mean, I think after a period of time,
kind of normalizes.
It normalizes out.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. So just for this last bit, I just want to ask if you could provide just some quick general health tips. Like I know it's hard to be.
We are a health and wellness podcast.
Okay, so for example, like one, washing your hands. I think people downplay.
They do it too much.
Not even
Sometimes
too much, but people
much,
downplay the importance of washing your hands. Or things along that level.
Well, clearly, if one of the big problems is that your hands are a great what we call transmission device. You get something on your hands, and you rub your eyes, you rub your nose, and you inoculate yourself. So this is a great way that various number of viruses are transmitted. So if you're in a place where you think you're getting contamination, use an adequate hand washing. Now, the adequate hand washing is typically you have to lather up for about 20-25 seconds. You're supposed to sing the ABCs, right? To really do that. And some people take it to the extreme and will do that 2 or 3 times. I worry about there's this other philosophy of what they call the hygiene hypothesis, that if you're too clean early on, you're at risk of developing, more possibly autoimmune diseases or allergic diseses. So I think that you need to be exposed to microorganisms as a child.
You absolutely do. I think that's I probably heard that such a long time ago, and it makes
playing some dirt.
Yeah, it makes so much sense to me, because if you're never exposed to any of these microbes, how does your body develop any ways to fight it?
Yeah. But you need to develop your own microbiome, and getting as much of these varied organisms, I think, is a good deal.
Yeah.
Because I have a dog, as a kid. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that is a good one.
Yeah. My mom and dad always told me to go outside.
Going outside's a good thing too.
Yeah.
Play in the dirt.
I think
So
that's
I
the thing we wanna see.
yeah, being clean is a good thing, but you can be too clean. My personal opinion.
Do you think people overuse hand sanitizer?
That's another thing.
I'm not worried about it because it's primarily isopropanol or ethanol.
Yeah.
It's not. There's not going to be. We won't be developing resistance to that.
Gotcha.
It other than drying out your hands. It's that doesn't bother me in the least.
Oh, gotcha. Interesting. So, wash your hands. Get
Don't
vaccinated.
wash your hands too much. Wash your hands properly.
Just sing the
but just
ABCs
do
while
it-
you sing.
Don't do it 2 or 3
Or
times.
while
in a
you
row.
while you wash.
Yeah.
Vaccinate yourself. Vaccinate your kids if you have kids.
Let your kids go outside.
Let your kids go outside. Don't put them in the bubble.
Yes.
And GMOs are safe. Vaccines don't cause autism. That's 5 big things right there.
Mhm.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Take care of yourself mentally. Don't let yourself get run down. I mean, that's you gotta be entertained. You have to keep your mind sharp and do a variety of things.
I agree, 100%.
I do have one more question, though. I do have one more question, and this has been bugging me for such a long time, so I'm glad that Mike brought you in today. I heard somewhere, I don't know if it was from a professor or maybe just some random person, but I heard that, because we were talking about yogurt, correct? I heard that if you consume yogurt that's been, that has a lot of added sugars, that completely defeats the purpose of having the prebiotics in it. Something in, like, with combining the sugar with the yogurt kills the
Bacteria.
bacteria. Exactly. Is there any truth to that?
I have not heard that. I have heard some people claim that artificial sweeteners are bad, so that you don't want to get a yogurt that's got that's full of saccharin or Splenda.
That's probably what it is, because a lot of yogurts are filled with artificial sweeteners, right? That sugar free.
Yeah.
That's probably
So I think there's I don't know for a fact that those are microbicidal. I haven't seen any studies.
Yeah.
I think somebody would have figured that out a long time
Okay.
ago.
If that were the
Alright.
case.
Yeah.
So so it sounds like someone just kind of peddling.
Yeah.
Some
Mhm.
BS.
Buy my yogurt because it has artificial sweeteners.
It's got the real stuff. Awesome. Dr. McGee, I don't think you really have any social media things or anything for anyone to follow, but I know you do have the lab that has social media, and you talked about that last time. Do you want to talk about that again?
Well, it's not really. It's primarily for scientists. It's
Okay. Just curious.
It's a website where we sell plasmids or genes.
Oh, okay. Well, weren't you talking about something like your lab or something like that has like a Facebook account and like
That's our DNA. That's our
That's what it
the
is.
plasmid repository.
Okay, gotcha.
If you need any plasmids, you need a scientist. Any scientists out there, go to DNASU.org.
There you go.
DNASU, I like that. All right, well, thank you so much for being here again. I promise I won't lose this episode this time.
It's come a third time.
All right, thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
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 So much again.